Kia ora everybody, Morena, and a very warm welcome and a very good morning to everyone from whichever part of New Zealand you are beaming in. In for a treat today. This is the FSC Connect webinar series. This is our way over the last couple of years through COVID to bring the sector together, to connect people together, to bring some of the leading lights in the New Zealand and global community on topics that are of importance to New Zealand, to our sector, to New Zealand consumers, in the hope that we share the knowledge, gain some wisdom from each other, and shed some insights on topics. And today's topic is a fantastic one. It's about the future of the New Zealand health system, which of course is undergoing significant change, and with a pandemic for the last 2 years has obviously been under considerable stress as everyone's had to pivot and learn to live and deal with the impacts of the pandemic. So really excited for this discussion. A big thank you to the FSC Health Committee for helping to curate this, and a big thank you to all of our panelists. I'm delighted to introduce Kuri Boyer from Southern Cross, who's the Chief Marketing and Sales Officer from Southern Cross, who's going to introduce the session, facilitate the panel. And with that, Kuri, really excited, and over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Welcome to this fascinating session today. We've got an amazing lineup for you. We've got Professor Gorman, who is an Emeritus Professor of Medicine, who is actually going to kick us off by setting the scene with his views on the reforms that we're heading into, alongside, of course, the current turmoil in the health system in response to COVID. And we'll follow that session up with a selection of experts, both from inside and outside the public and private system and the health funding space. So we've got Nick Astrick, CEO of Southern Cross Health Society, and Louise Zessest, who is the CEO of Unimed. And we also have Torsten Engel, who is from Deloitte, a partner at Deloitte, to add their views into a really interesting, multifaceted and pretty complex situation. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Des to get us underway with his views and where it is that we're heading. Over to you, Des.
Oh, kia ora tātou. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this morning on a subject which I think we all think is very important, well, increasingly important. What I'm planning to do is to start with a couple of comments about our COVID management and to segue from there into the health reforms and what I think the health reforms should look like. I think the outstanding feature of our response to COVID is that we were ill-prepared for every phase, whether it was a phase of the viral pandemic or whether it was an intervention phase like immunisation or boosters. We were simply unprepared for every single step. Now, you can forgive us for being unprepared for the initial outbreak in February 2020, but I don't think it's forgivable that we were so poorly ready for everything else that happened, particularly when you consider that New Zealand is a small island nation where we don't live on top of each other, we have low population densities, we don't live with our animals, we have lots of wind and sun. Of all the parts of the world, geographically, demographically, socially, we were best equipped to do very well through this pandemic. And so what do I think underpins this lack of readiness? I think we've had problems from the get-go with governance and management, and we've also had significant limitations placed in our response by the capacity of the health system, and hence the segue. What we've seen is quite weak governance, and that's because we've had a significantly politicised governance of the pandemic. And everywhere in the world where it has been politicised, there has been variable degrees of dysfunction. And it's for good reason that our complex utilities like ACC, the Reserve Bank, and the Superannuation Fund are governed by professional boards. There's a very good reason for that. And as well as, I think, weak governance, we've had reasonably poor management. And again, that's not surprising. We've asked a policy shop, the Ministry of Health, to take on a very complex operational task, and they've struggled. And they've struggled to the point that they've found it difficult to deliver on almost anything. And the third aspect, I think, of our COVID management, which is relevant for today, is that it's put a spotlight on our health system and the limitations of that system. And you're all well aware that over this year, for example, our management of the pandemic is not in your best interest, it's not in my best interests, it's not in the best interest of the economy. It's been designed to protect the health system. So instead of the health system being an adjunct and a strength in our response, it has been a significant weakness. And it's the thing that we're having to accommodate. Now, New Zealanders view healthcare the way they view insurance. They just assume that when they need it, it'll be there. And they just assume that it's going to be okay. And they take it from physicians like me and other health professionals that the health system's in good shape. And most of the time, they are pleasantly surprised to find it is. But just as often, they actually find that there are significant problems which they never were aware of. Our health system, I think you could characterise it as being unsustainable, and it's mainly unsustainable because of workforce issues. It's unaffordable, and it's largely unaffordable because of the ageing of our community and the advent of new technologies, given that we are a pay-as-you-go tax-based system. And the third thing is it's unfair. The way in which you experience our health system depends on who you are, where you are, and what you need, want, or expect. And that unfairness is how most health systems fail. Very few health systems just implode. They generally fail by growing inequity. And right now, you could look at our health system and say that's a health system in failure because the inequities now are quite significant. Now, the government's reforms is aimed to get rid of what they call the postcode lottery, but it's far more complex than that. It's just not where you live. It's who you are and what your needs or wants or expectations are. The unfairness is far broader than just a postcode lottery. And I struggle to see how you solve a postcode lottery by getting rid of 20 DHBs and introducing 100 localities. That defies logic in my mind. Our system has struggled really since 1938 when Michael Joseph Savage tried to introduce a universal healthcare system that's healthcare free at the point of delivery. And he was successful for hospitals, but the general practitioners rolled over the top of him, and general practice remained a fee-for-service, privately delivered service. And in fact, 10 years later in the United Kingdom with the National Health Service, exactly the same thing was repeated. And we, like the British, have only got half the equation for universalism right. We know who's entitled. It's every citizen of New Zealand or every citizen of the United Kingdom, but we've never defined what they're entitled to. We've never actually said these are the things that your membership of our society entitles you to receive. The only person that really had a go at that was one national health minister who tried to define what core services might look like, but he wasn't successful in actually identifying a core of services. The other things that New Zealanders are unaware of in terms of our universal healthcare system is how dependent we are on a large population of taxpayers who don't consume healthcare. And the minute the demographic changes and you end up with a larger population of non-tax-paying health consumers, then the pay-as-you-go system falls over, and that's what's happening here and in the United Kingdom at the moment. The other thing is that universalism requires rationing. I mean, by definition, if you have universal healthcare, you have to ration, and the rationing occurs by way of entitlements and access, in other words, queuing. And most New Zealanders actually aren't aware of this rationing until they end up in a queue. And then they suddenly think, hang on a minute, where is my universal access? So since 1938, we've had every incoming government, actually, since 1938 has tried to, quote, reform, unquote, healthcare to try and resolve this anomaly between a universal hospital system and a privilege-based primary care or community system. And in fact, they've failed to do so. And in fact, one of the sad things about the current reforms is they don't appear to show that there's been any learning from all those previous failures. And for example, I just mentioned to you in 1938 how the general practitioners rolled over the top of Michael Joseph Savage. And I just want you to think about that. A man with all the political capital of the Great Depression got rolled by the general practitioners. Now, that's an illustration of what Murray Horn and I call a political health economy. And in fact, political economies throughout the history of our health system have actually thwarted any attempt at reform, because the starting point for these economies is that whatever the reform looks like, it must not depreciate their privilege or their status or their income or whatever. And failing to attend to the political economies means you're simply setting up a system for failure. So let's look at the current reforms then and just look at the extent to which I think they're likely to resolve the issues of unsustainability, unaffordability and unfairness. In my view, they are a collection of structural changes, as we've been doing since 1983. Since 1983, our health reforms have been really focused on structure. And what we know from reforms of service industries anywhere on the planet is that that's a recipe for failure. If you don't have clarity around what sort of customer experience you're trying to bring to life, if you don't have clarity around how people will experience the health system differently, if what you're focused on is structure, then that in fact, as you know, is getting form in front of function, and that's a recipe for failure. I teach health leadership on a program which is jointly delivered by Monash University and Harvard, and we teach how to go about health reforms. And I have to say that if someone submitted a project which looked like the New Zealand health reforms, we'd tell them to go and do it again, because it is the antithesis of change by design. Change by design requires that you know who all your customers are, and that is people who are sick or injured, people who are going to provide healthcare, people who fund the healthcare, educators, it's going to be regulators. It's a very broad group of customers. What are their needs, wants, and expectations? The next thing you do is look at different operating models which might address all those diverse needs, wants, and expectations. And then what you do, of course, is you identify what sort of workforce, capital, and IT you need to make those operating models come to life. And last, you look at structure. And in fact, in my view, the forms that I've been involved with, which have been successful, there's been an agnostic approach to structure and a willingness to allow it to evolve to the most efficient shape to deliver on the operating models. You couldn't imagine health reforms worse timed than this. I mean, dramatic health reforms, blowing up the health systems that were in the middle of a pandemic, would seem to me to be very poorly timed. And the issue here is the tyranny of business as usual. You can't blow up a whole health system. It's like the A380 analogy. If you're trying to redesign and re-engineer an A380 while it's in flight, the first thing you've got to do to look after your crew and your freight and your passengers is have a system in place to keep the plane flying, business as usual. And then you change one thing at a time. What you don't do is blow the whole system up. And if I look at this reform, and it has all the harbingers of failure, it's politicised. It's ideologically based on centralising bureaucracy. It does not have any clarity around the customer experience. And it's repeating the structural reform, well, it's reversing structural reforms. In other words, this Labor government is dismantling the changes that the last Labor government put in place. And you get the sense of flip-flop, flip-flop. And in the last few minutes when I'm talking to you, I'll just suggest what I would do instead. I think there's three things that I would recommend. The first is consistent with that idea of not blowing the whole health system up at once. Where would you focus to get the biggest lift in productivity? And the answer, in my mind, is in primary care and in community care. We could go anywhere in the world to different hospitals, and in fact, the business is pretty similar. Hospitals are hospitals and they run like hospitals. I'm not saying there's no opportunity for economies of scale and scope. There are, but those are reasonably modest gains. Whereas if you look at the diversity in primary care, you've got concierge medicine, you've got virtual medicine, you've got capitated medicine, you've got fee-for-service medicine, you have nurse-led health programs. You have an incredible diversity. Within that diversity, there's huge opportunity for reform and substantive productivity lift. So I think the first focus has to be on primary care and on community care. The second focus is on getting the funding right. The operating model will follow the funding. And so the funding has to be attended to. And there are two things I think we need to pay attention to. The first of those is social investment. Murray Horn and I proposed this in 2014 in a paper that we wrote for the Ministry on Health Funding Reform. And our attitude then was that for chronic conditions, or for conditions which had broad social impact, then social investment was the correct way to go about business. And of course, the poster children for social investment are people with mental health problems and children with learning disabilities or children with health problems which stop them from participating fully in school. Both those communities would substantively benefit from a social investment approach. The other type of funding that I think needs close attention is what's happening now in the disabled community, where groups of disabled people have been given their budget. They have been given ownership of their budget, and they employ the people who provide them with care. And this is proving hugely successful. They are showing themselves to be very savvy purchasers of healthcare. And so again, for conditions like, for people with disabilities and for conditions like mental health problems, budget holding by the people who have the health problems is an idea whose time has come and we should fully explore it. And my final comment is that all of these things I'm talking about have to be wrapped up in clarity around the customer experience. What will people experience differently because of the reform? How will their access to healthcare change because of the reform? How will their treatment change because of the reform? How will their ownership of their own health change because of the reform? How will they become self-managing because of the reform? And in fact, the current reforms, as you can see by looking at them, have no clarity around what that change in customer experience is likely to be or is desired to be. So I'm going to finish there. The point I'm making to you is that what the COVID pandemic has done has demonstrated what some of us have known for a while, which is that our health system is unsustainable, unaffordable, and unfair. Sadly, unfortunately, I think this current government reform package looks very much like every other government reform package since 1938, and I can confidently say it'll have the same outcome. And thank you very much for your attention this morning.
Wow, thank you, Professor Des. That's not the most rosy of picture you've painted for us. I'm going to invite our panellists, Torsten, Nick, Louise, to turn your cameras on and come and join the conversation. Now, for those of you that are listening and have got some burning questions as a result of Professor Des's introduction this morning, there is a Q&A option within Zoom that you should be able to click on and pop any questions in that we will attempt to address. Meanwhile, I might kick off with some thoughts and reflections from our panellists. So something I'm interested in, really, Professor Des talked a little bit about some similarities going on in the UK. So perhaps a question for you, Torsten. What's going on globally? What other jurisdictions should we be looking to for great examples of things that could work or should be considered in the mix here in New Zealand?
Well, thanks, Kuri. So when we look at international reforms across UK, Canada, and other jurisdictions, there's definitely some winning themes that emerge. And the first one, and I think Des made the point very clearly, is you need to be clear on what success looks like. So most reforms have an underlying goal around bending the cost curve because of productivity or efficiency reasons, or they want to bend the demand curve and reduce demand on hospitalizations. And if you take those at an aggregate level, you need to be really clear and honest what your starting position is and have some numbers and metrics against it. So, for example, in New Zealand, we have a staffing ratio of around 2.4 nurses per bed. When you look at the OECD tables, OECD average is 1.4. However, we have fewer hospital beds per million or per thousand than many of the other OECD countries. So we know straight off the bat that we just don't seem to be sort of in alignment with what good looks like for demand curves or for cost curves. Our ASH rates, so the ambulatory sensitive hospitalizations, again, are very high, which comes back to Professor Gorman's point around primary care isn't actually necessarily keeping people out of the hospital, which is the whole purpose of having primary and community care. So those jurisdictions that have been really clear on what is our goal and then started to think through what are the capabilities I need to achieve those goals. Then I go into my processes, my operating model, and my functions, and structure comes at the very end. And you sort of think about it about a game of rugby. Everybody's an armchair critic when we're watching somebody else play the game. But you're very clear it's about scoring tries or conversions or something. And you don't shuffle around your team players and, rotate forwards and backs and, randomly just jostle people around expecting better performance. You expect your coach and everybody to be very clear on the outcome and then structure and play all around that. And that's a key success factor for any health reform.
Thank you. Thinking about, Professor Des also talked about, the GP system as well as the hospital system. There's also the private system as well. So I wonder whether Nick or Louise, maybe Nick, you might want to open up with your views around what the reform might mean for the private system working in concert with public.
Yeah, thanks, Kuri. Morena, everyone. Thanks, Des, for that introduction. I think just a couple of things, if I may, just to, reaffirm. I guess whether it's the private system or the public system, and in the New Zealand context, there's three major funders of health. There's the government, obviously, for largely in the public system. You've got ACC, who's really buying for accident care, and prehab and rehabilitation. And then you've got the private industry, that I guess is funding a private delivery system. But if you stand back from private or public, it is not unrealistic to say that both the private and the public systems are unsustainable. So totally, optimism and pessimism are both forms of fatalism. So the real view is at the moment on any given day, when you look at the public system or the private system, and the private system's largely, the price is increasing largely because the private system is geared to efficiency, excellent efficiency and utilisation drives premium price. In the public system, the main drivers, particularly on the demand side, is ageing demography, chronic disease, the price of technology, more services being available. When demand is going to overwhelm a fixed supply, it is technically unsustainable, and that's what it is at the moment. I would say great people who fundamentally care and highly competent. I think that's one thing we've got relative to the world. We've got an excellent and highly capable workforce, albeit there is workforce stress and pressures on them. What we have is an unsustainable system. And I think that's probably where my advocation comes from. In the private sectors or public sectors, when you look across the world, there are some countries, Germany, Switzerland, Japan, for example, who do focus on the systematisation of delivery of health. But also New Zealand's not alone. Actually, a lot of public and private systems are really struggling with leaning into what it takes to make their systems more sustainable. And I think one thing that we are sort of probably driving, as I guess my comment can be from the private system, is I guess when you look at great systems across the world, they have a number of things in common. The first is they are very customer driven. And when businesses that have to compete to win based on delivering to their customers, they have to be very customer driven. They need to deeply understand their needs. They are very, very clear on the outcomes they must deliver. I mean, I would probably, while we call New Zealand's private and public system a health system, it's actually a sick care system. It is actually a system that processes sickness as under a capitated or rationed way, largely. It is not a health system. So again, being very, very clear about the outcomes that you need to actually deliver is fundamentally, and measure them. And I think most businesses would understand that you need to measure those outcomes to make them real and transparent and gear the system. Secondly, I completely agree with Des. The incentives for those outcomes need to be clear. The funding needs to align to those outcomes. But then you should stand back. And I think one of the opportunities New Zealand has to develop is the ability to scale innovation. I mean, the only way through an unsustainable position where demand is going to overwhelm supply is where you have to actually scale innovation. You have to use let the system scale and innovate at a point to deliver to those customer needs. So I think whether it's public or private, Kuri, sustainability is our real risk for slightly different reasons, and we both need to be able to lean in to making sure that there's enough innovation in the system, the delivery system, to deliver clear outcomes and make sure that the funding is aligned to that.
Thanks, Nick. Des, have you got any views to add to that? Certainly in the short term, when we go live in July with the reforms, the interplay, the immediate interplay between public and private, and what you think will play out.
Yeah. By the way, I agree with the exemplar cited of good systems, Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany. They are exemplars, not the United Kingdom for me. Look, I think already there's a level of interdependency between the private and public systems, Kuri. Already you're seeing a lot of high technology medical need being met by the private system because the public can't. I think after July, I expect some degree of administrative chaos. And I think in that chaos, particularly post-COVID, with the incredible tail that COVID's going to cause for non-COVID related illness, I think there's going to be a need for the public system to purchase a lot of care from private providers, or they're going to end up either with only the most desperately ill receiving care or waiting lists for Africa. So I actually think whether they like it or not, there's going to have to be a greater accommodation of the public need through private delivery mechanisms. Already, if you want a PET CT scan, you'll be going privately. Already, if you want sophisticated radiation therapy, you'll be going private. And already the overflow of the public surgical needs being met in private hands. And I think that will continue. And I think for ACC, for example, as a former board member, I don't think ACC will be looking to the public system to help address its needs for its customers because it simply can't wait that long. So I think ACC will be increasing its purchasing from out of the private system because it bears the long-term cost of not addressing health problems adequately. I don't think it will. I don't think it can live in the same place the public system lives with in terms of the ramifications of unmet health need aren't a burden on the health system. They're a burden on the justice system, on social development, MSD. They're a burden on the education system and so on. And hence the point I was making to you before about social investment and social commissioning.
It sounds like the combination of the healthcare reforms going live and our COVID backlog, that we have both our public and private systems are going to be under a fair amount of pressure. Louise, I'm interested in your perspective on the implications of that for insurers as well as care providers in these changing times.
Kia ora, everyone. Special call out to Des, Morena Des. Look, from my perspective, I've worked in and around the health sector, both in the public sector and the private sector for a number of years, as well as on the health funding side. And, Nick raised the point that what we actually have is a sickness system. And really what we've been talking around capacity and capability is how do we enable people who are unwell to access services. And clearly, if we have backlogs and issues within the public sector, that's going to have flow-on impact in the private sector. But we also mustn't think about these as two separate systems, because we get too caught up in the structure, going back to where Des started, because the workforce actually works across both. Health services in primary and community care are delivered by publicly delivered services and privately delivered services. The whole localities model that's being proposed for primary care assumes that there will be clustering of providers, be they pharmacists who are private businesses or, district nursing services delivered by Health New Zealand. Those are going to have to work in a very collaborative way. I think if we truly are wanting to see a change towards a system that is focused on keeping New Zealanders in good health, and I guess that comes back to the objectives that we were talking about before. There are going to be some inherent tensions over the next period of time because we're going to have capacity constraints due to people who need to access services. And the reality is hospitals consume huge amounts of money. So when I had time working in Kanti's Manukau District Health Board, to achieve the shift to a more primary and community-based system is very, very hard to achieve because of just, the money. So we come back to Des's comment about where the money goes. For us sitting here as insurers, the people that we support to access healthcare have the choice of accessing services through the public system or through the private system. They obviously choose the private system because they're looking at getting, speedier access and choice over what they do. And I think we could face some challenges over the coming period with some capacity constraints from both a workforce perspective and also a facility perspective. Keeping in mind, I think, Torsten, work I did with some of your colleagues a couple of years back, we know that, for example, in our largest city, Auckland, there are capacity constraints in things like public hospital beds, and building new capacity, you can't turn that on overnight. And that capacity constraint will flow through. As Des said, we'll get ACC saying, hey, we're going to need to contract more of that out to the private system. Nick and I sitting on this side, well, we've got, members who want to access healthcare. We are all going to probably be wanting to access more constrained capacity. And so we are going to need innovation. And that's where I really reinforce what Nick said. We will need innovation. We will need to look at how can services be delivered in different ways, but we also need to anchor it with some objectives. And I'm interested to see Margiapa was focusing on the whole thing of equity and improving life expectancy for Maori as one of the areas that she's called out.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, there's a couple of great questions online around some of those areas, which we'll switch to in a second. Nick, would you add anything before we close down the conversation around implications for insurers? Would you add anything to what Louise has suggested?
I think that's been well covered. I think there is a genuine belief, and for a long time both systems have been largely complementary, and if we're going to solve health for New Zealand and we're going to shift it from processing sickness to generating more healthy years in your life, then it is going to require a pan system approach. It is going to require all in, and I think we've just got to get through the malaise of it. What I have learned is health is extremely dense. There's multiple operators. I think Des will call it a zero-sum game at times. There's winners and losers in it. I think the question is how do we make sure that from the clinicians and the front lines to the funders to all the healthcare providers out there, we understand what great looks like and we do marshal our way there over time. And so I don't think it is around a compete and divide. It is ultimately about how do we unify and how do we actually pursue those outcomes that New Zealand deserves and can achieve.
Thanks, Nick. Torsten, there's a question online which I might throw to you. Does the Māori Health Authority have the opportunity to put function before the form and define outcomes in a way that Health New Zealand doesn't?
I think it absolutely does. And what I really like and what I'm excited about is kaupapa Māori and the broader concept of oranga. which actually challenges exactly that allopathic model, that Nick and Louise referred to. Now, the traditional Western medicine has grown up with this: take an aspirin, see me in the morning, take penicillin, get rid of your infection. And it's a sort of bop or mole approach. And leading health jurisdictions are starting to think about spiritual, mental well-being, the social determinants of health, and this whole rich array of stuff that happens to you outside the health system. And the health system is kind of just the ambulance at the bottom of a cliff called life. And if you sort of reflect on the Maori worldviews and the richness to, a person that they bring to their family, to their, the whakapapa and everything else, that is not something that we would routinely do in Western medicine. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that lots of Pākehā will also embrace that. They might not be familiar with the terms, they might not be familiar with the concepts, but there's a lot of rich pickings in there for everybody in New Zealand to actually go, you know what, take a 360 view of me as a person, my family, my work, my circumstances, and my life, and help me lead the best possible life that I can based on the circumstances I find myself in. And I noticed the other question from Fiona on mental health, and that's a really easy way to illustrate how this should play out, if you will, if you get it right. We've announced, a couple of years ago now, a massive funding boost to primary mental health and addiction services, but we're really struggling with making the announcement and rubber hitting the road. But it is absolutely the right mindset to sort of say, give people a chance to connect with somebody at the human level, with counselors, peer coaches, potentially people that we have brought from the local rugby club into, roles, and just community leaders who can actually help out and take a holistic perspective on what ails you. What we haven't done well is bring the innovation into that. If you sort of think about telemedicine and being able to do that at a distance, we sort of bolted on some, e-mental health applications, but they're out here, and my face-to-face interaction is over here. The leading jurisdictions in mental health bring together the e-mental health ways of working into the clinical setting, into the person-to-person interactions, and into the care path. They're not a sort of two-speed model where use an app on one side of the fence and maybe get counseling support or peer group support from somebody else. So I think we have chances and opportunities to really innovate and deliver far more holistic capabilities and operating models that bring tech, telemedicine, digital tools, and people together in just very different ways.
Thanks, Torsten. You've covered off a couple of questions in one go there. Des, I'm interested, that's all good. I'm interested in your thoughts around where you talked about, I think a few of us have talked about innovation, and where you would like to see that coming from first. Is it in the technology space? Is it in different care models? Where do you see the sort of pressing opportunity we should be leaning into?
Thank you. Comment first on the Maori Health Authority. I think it will live and die on the confidence of the practitioners in the authority, their ability to invest in developing counterfactuals for existing services, and it will live and die on their ability to harness whole of the government, because the most successful trial that I've been involved with through MSD in terms of mental health for young Maori in Northland, we have achieved great results by focusing on getting them a place to live and finding them a job. And we've spent no money at all on conventional psychological therapy. And the reason why we drove towards employment and accommodation is because that's what the community told us that they wanted. So I think the real innovation will come from a close relationship between providers and the community to co-develop solutions which genuinely address their needs. But the problem, particularly for mental health, is that unless we seriously address the social determinants of that mental health, then conventional Western psychological treatment, irrespective of how it's delivered, won't cut the mustard. And it's just fascinates me, that trial in Northland where the achievement of a place to live with some dignity and a job has been successful in actually moving a lot of people off quite significant drug dependence. So I actually think the innovation will come in terms of collaborative working, but it needs to be seen across the whole of government. So the question for me about the Maori health authorities, does it have the competence to invest in commissioning, alliance contracting? Does it have the ability to actually harness resources from other parts of government? Because what I've seen over the last couple of decades is that our public service is still very insular.
I think that, I guess that plays up the question around how the co-governance will actually work, because that is a very new model for us, and I think it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. Any additional thoughts on the co-governance Māori Health Authority? Nick, Louise, any reactions or reflections?
Look, I think it's, as I say, the reforms are starting with the structural reforms, as Des has pointed out. The question is, the reform that's actually required is the reform to the system of delivery. What I do observe across the world is a couple of facts in New Zealand. 80% of New Zealand's future healthcare costs is going to come from 20% of the population. And as Des points out, a large amount of that demand is driven from the social determinants, housing, lifestyle, financial wherewithal, well-being, all those sorts of componentry. So I think we've just got to admit that our system sort of kicks in, when you are sick, I think, and that's fine. We have to make sure that can scale, but I think health investment needs to be a lot more upstream. And now that does cut across political control, behavioural change, all those sorts of things. And we do know, and what we do see in our members, our 900,000 members, is sort of the baby boomers are probably more, and we want to be looked after, when we do fall ill. But the younger ones are a lot more in that empowered space. They do want to understand their well-being, their risks to their health, and they're probably a little bit more accountable for that. So we are seeing some shifts in that. But again, in the 20%, we do know that there is, as Des correctly says, the current system doesn't break. What it does is, and through its rationing, is create inequality and inequity. And it is indisputable that there is inequity. If you look at the Health and Disability Report, that's one of the key, obviously, findings, but key, I guess, contextual pieces for the reforms that are here. So again, I would say that focusing on the delivery of services for that to reduce the inequity here, which means the equal outcomes, not just equal access, is critical. The question then comes down, as Des says, to excellence of delivery, not just intent.
Agreed.
And perhaps if I can comment a little bit on co-governance. I've had the opportunity to work in co-governance models for delivery of community-based services in various parts of the country, and it's hard. It's not an easy process to get those co-governance structures working. But when they do work, you can make a really big difference for people. And I think, what's in my mind is some of the early work I was involved with, working with Ngati Porou up the East Coast, where you have very isolated populations. And these are the populations that Des was talking about. They don't have running water, and people don't have the housing that they need. And actually the local community knows what is required, but they need the support around them and access to capabilities to deliver what they need for their local people. And I think it is, how can we really listen to what local communities need and want, and then translate that into actionable service models.
Thanks, Louise. There's a question here from Juliet online, which is really questioning whether New Zealand needs a cultural shift. We think it's our right to have free healthcare, and is that really realistic with all of the issues we've heard around pent-up demand, rationing, and access, equality of access? there are a lot of New Zealanders who can afford private insurance who don't have it because they think healthcare should be free. She's suggesting that might need to change to free up the system for those who can afford it. I wonder who might like to take that question.
Yeah, look, I think there's two things that are really important in life: is education and health. They shouldn't be used as political footballs. And I live in New Zealand on the basis that that we should have a good health system and a very good education system. We are a civil society, and so I do think there are some rights there. But that doesn't mean a universal system, it's not a bottomless pit of money. So the system, and so I do think it's going to have to change. I think New Zealand does have to mature its conversation from local politics, such as I need a hospital on my corner, because to actually more of a national conversation, more of a lot more around how do we use data and digital and in-home rather than the classic model of hospital care. And so I do feel like there is a maturing of the conversation that is required if we're actually going to get to a more sustainable position. But I still feel that New Zealand should be fighting for its rights, to make sure that there is a provision of healthcare, unless we end up like the basket case, which is America, where the emergency department is really the health system of a large amount of Americans. It is the best and worst system in the world. And so I do feel like, given our background, there should be a primary care and a provision service, but at the end of the day, it's not going to be able to deliver everything. So the combination of different providers, different delivery systems, different funders is still really important.
Yeah. Torsten, I see you've got a thought there.
Yeah, and I think the other jurisdictions that do this well are honest and give you information so that you as a consumer can genuinely navigate the system. And what I mean by that is, Des alluded to it, we never defined a national services catalogue. So right now you have kind of no idea what is your taxpayer buying, your dollar buying you in the public health system. And that creates a huge array of expectations. Whereas if you have this is covered by public health, you essentially have a white line or a red line in the sand and say, these are the services we will and we won't cover. That allows you to make choices and, manage your own risk profile. And we kind of do it by stealth through Pharmac. So if I want normal medicines, reasonably off-patent and generically substitutable, I have a whole array of meds available. But if I want something a bit more, modern or, God help you, CAR T cell therapy or modern, cancer drugs, including masking agents, I probably have to go overseas. And the same for certain types of surgery. ACC, again, is reasonably explicit. We know what we get and what we're entitled to because it's an entitlement-based system enshrined in legislation. So I think the important thing is to get the balance right between honesty about what are you getting and allowing people to then navigate and make the choices that they can afford and that can work for them. Ideally, you want your social safety net to be as high as possible and as universally accessible as possible. But you probably do need to draw a line somewhere and sort of say, look, certain things we just will not fund through the public health system.
Thank you, Louise. I thought you had a comment to make there as well.
Yeah, I was just about to leap in exactly as Torsten did, and linking back to what Des said, about the two components that, you need. And one of those was just being quite explicit around actually what the public sector delivers, or what we can expect as Kiwis. I endorse totally what Nick's saying. We need a really good, strong, robust health system for New Zealand, and we are very lucky that we do have that. But I think it does come back to there being some clarity. And I guess an example in point is that the default is rationing out of the public system. That's done through, some very well-developed clinical guidelines that are used across the public system, but they're not explicit for consumers. And so I think making some of those more explicit would help people understand and be able to then make their decisions.
Yeah. There's quite a few questions coming through, and we're not going to have an opportunity to get to all of them. But there is one which I thought was quite interesting. The interplay between ACC, public health, the private health sector, the insurance sector, somewhere in there is an answer, or at least is a better solution. What are the things that could be, the changes that could be considered to kind of break those walls down and get that engagement across those boundaries happening to get a better outcome for all New Zealanders? So, Des, have you got some thoughts on that?
Yes, I do. I think those questions around ACC are very insightful because New Zealanders have a high regard for ACC and are confident in it, and yet it's based on premiums and it's fully forward funded and it invests over the horizon. In other words, what New Zealand's health system needs is a change in funding from tax-based pay-as-you-go to a lifetime contribution to an insurance type fund which enables investment over the horizon. So in fact, I think what encourages me that New Zealand could make the shift to a more modern way of funding healthcare is the fact that we have such a high regard for ACC, which is a living model. I mean, we're not, in my time on ACC board, it moved from pay-as-you-go with a liability of $30 billion to fully forward funded, where every time we met, we looked at the outstanding claims liability and how much money we had in the bank. So it is possible to make the shift from pay-as-you-go, where you're incurring a debt for your grandkids and their grandkids, to fully forward funded, where we contribute across our lifetimes by way of premiums. Now, clearly, the minute you mention the word insurance and insurance-based systems, a certain proportion of the New Zealand public are going to go feral. But in fact, it works extremely well in sophisticated countries like Germany and Switzerland and the Netherlands. I mean, it is the way of the future because you're looking at expertise in actuarialism, expertise in commissioning. You're looking at people who can genuinely invest in a way where you're looking at the long-term return on investment in terms of people's wellness. So I think one of the conversations we have to have is that without demography being the way it is, we can't rely on a relatively declining population of tax-paying non-health consumers to fund my generation. We simply, our healthcare needs. So we need to make a shift in actually the basic revenue generation for health, and that's what sophisticated modern Western countries are doing.
I'm sure there are others that have got a burning response to that. So I'll allow Thorsten, Nick, Louise.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised when I looked at the scope of the Heather Simpson review, which ultimately led to the reforms, and it explicitly excluded ACC. And, lots of people in health talk about we have a two-factor, if you will, or two-speed health system. It's fast-forward and reasonably seamless with ACC, but it's a really tough journey if you're sick for public health reasons and it's not caused by an injury. And that in itself increases inequity. So if we're serious about our outcomes needing to be around reducing inequities for a starter, then you can't just ignore ACC and the relationship with the public health system. You have to take you have to take a deeper look at the health system and actually think about what are the roles of these different funding models and how do they come together to give us the outcomes that we want.
Absolutely.
Kuri, just quickly from my perspective, I mean, the private system is largely geared for efficiency. The whole funding is on a procedure base. Healthcare providers maximise, I guess, their return on assets or long term by being full. So the system is geared for efficiency. It does drive premium up to an unsustainable level, but different systems are incentivised for different and operate in different ways. It's really how do you orchestrate that in a more coordinated way. I think it's the opportunity. I just noticed in the Q&A, there's a lot of line of inquiry really about FBT, if we fund the private, all those sorts of things. So just a really quick comment on that. at the end of the day, I think the private system, when you look at elective surgery, is doing about 55% of elective surgery at the moment. Yeah. Obviously, the public system picks up a large amount of chronic care, the stuff that private insurers just don't fund. So there's always been a very long question around, give us, companies avoid the FBT to buy health insurance that will save the public system money. Just clarity. The private system, if it didn't exist, would I guess put a weight on the public system to really challenge it. There's no doubt about it whatsoever. But today, if they did give those incentives, the argument of the public system at the moment is it just would shorten the queues. It doesn't reduce the cost in the public system. That's the conversation going on. But I must admit, it is maturing. I think, given what Des has said, when they look down the next 5 to 10 years, the conversation is maturing into what are the right incentives that we should be putting in to ensure that we maximise, I guess, the health outcomes for every dollar we spend. So I think that conversation is warming up, not to the point of just FBT avoidance. We're not at that level yet at the moment, but actually how do we get the systems working in a more coordinated way? What incentives do we need to put in to make sure that that's happening? So I think it's thawing, but it's still just because I incent the private system doesn't mean to say I save money in the public system. I just shorten its queue. Yeah, that's probably the argument at the moment.
And one thing that I would add, where we actually do have the three systems, private insurance, ACC and the public sector coming together in quite a focused manner, is in workplace health activity. So both Southern Cross NIC and ourselves, Unimed, very involved in workplace-based health schemes. And typically those employers are very active on the ACC space as well. And so if we were looking at how might we drive innovation, I think there could be some really interesting opportunities there. And it's also a way of, if we come from a customer-centric perspective, looking at how do we design solutions that actually work for employees and their whānau, and also for the corporate parts of New Zealand that are actually funding their employees to have access to services.
Completely agree. It's definitely innovation can come from lots of different places. It would be lovely if it was driven by our government and the health sector reforms, but it's more often than not driven by a small group of people passionate about getting a better outcome for their people and bringing the right people to the table to have the conversation. So we are 10:28 by my watch. People. So thank you so much to our panellists for some really insightful, challenging and probably confronting realities of our next road ahead in our health system here in New Zealand. We know there are a lot of challenges to play out yet, and the hope is that it's less political and more focused on the patient, the customer that's experiencing the journey. I'm going to ask Richard to come back online and close our session today. So thanks so much to Professor Des, Torsten, Louise and Nick very much for your time today. Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry, and thank you to the panel. Amen to your closing comments, Kerry. I think quality healthcare is something we want for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids, and getting the settings right are so important. So thank you all for a very interesting and provocative discussion. Folks, this was recorded and will be available on our FSC website coming shortly. If there are any topics or ideas people want to hear from us, let us know. So just drop us an email at the FSC website. Coming up next week, we have a similar conversation, although this one is focused on the outlook for the life insurance sector. Again, a bit of a future gaze. We've got a fantastic panel and really delighted to have Claire Bollingford from the FMA join us, along with a really strong panel to unpack some of the conversations that she'll have. So on that note, great job, Kerry. Thank you. Thank you again to the panel. It's 10:30. Kia ora, everyone. Have an awesome rest of the day. And thanks for joining. Bye for now.